The text came in at 10:47 at night, and Zion Calloway read it 3 times before he let himself breathe. Around him, the Sterling Grand Ballroom moved the way ballrooms do when the people inside them have more money than memory, loud and bright, and just a little cruel at the edges. Crystal chandeliers turned everything gold. The flowers on every table were white and untouched and probably cost more per arrangement than Zion made in a week. The air held perfume and champagne, and the low steady hum of 800 people who were very sure of where they stood in the world and didn't think often about the people who didn't. Zion stood near the far window with a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched and watched the room the way he always watched rooms, from the edge, quietly, taking in all the exits without making it obvious that he was doing it. He was dressed well. Silver gray coat, clean shoes, a face that gave nothing away unless you knew what to look for. Most people glanced at him once, filed him as non-threatening, and moved on. That was fine. Useful even. He had come here for one reason. A woman named Sandra Osai, a human rights attorney with connections to the Alaskan Territory Relocation Office, had promised that tonight she would hand over the papers that would officially secure Cairo's residency status. Cairo. 6 years old, gap-toothed, allergic to walnuts, currently asleep in a hotel suite 4 blocks away with a babysitter who charged $45 an hour and was worth every cent. He pulled his phone out when it buzzed. The message was from a number he had never seen. No name, no signature, just one sentence sitting on a white screen like a lit match dropped in a dry room. I know what you took. Bring the boy or I tell them everything. Hi viewers, if someone sent you that message in the middle of a room full of people who already had no reason to trust you, what would your very first move be? Drop it in the comments right now. I need to see what you do. Zion's thumb stopped moving over the screen. The noise of the ballroom kept going around him, laughter, glass against glass. A string quartet playing something light near the east wall, but all of it went distant, like someone had turned a volume knob that only affected the outside world and left his own chest ringing in the quiet. He exhaled through his nose. Steady, even, the same breath he used when Cairo had a nightmare and Zion needed to be the calm thing in the room. He typed back, "Who is this?" Delivered. Then nothing. He scanned the room slowly. 800 people, any one of them could have sent it, or none of them. The number could be a burner, the sender could be across town. He had no way to know, and not knowing made the cold in his chest spread wider. He put the phone back in his coat pocket and picked up his water glass. He took one sip, then his phone lit up again, not with a reply but with an alert. The kind that spreads through a room of wealthy, connected people the way fire spreads through dry grass. Fast, low, and without any mercy at all. He looked at the screen. Mega caretaker linked to Voss financial leak, trust assets missing, child used as cover. His name was in the second paragraph. His picture, pulled from a charity dinner 2 years ago where he had stood in the background of someone else's photograph, sat right beneath the headline. He looked calm in the photo. He looked like exactly the kind of person a headline like this could stick to without many people stopping to ask follow-up questions. He kept his face completely still. He was very good at keeping his face still, but his hands below the rim of the table went tight around the water glass. The first person to look at him was a woman in diamonds near the floral arrangement to his left. She looked at her phone, then at him, then at her phone again. When she looked up the third time, her expression had the specific coolness of someone who has already filed you under probably guilty and is now just watching to see how you handle it. The second person was a man near the bar who had been laughing 30 seconds ago and now was not. Then 3 more people noticed. Then 6. The shift moved through the room the way these things move, not all at once, not like a wave, but like a slow turning of heads, one at a time, each person checking the alert and then checking the room and then finding him and letting their expressions say what their manners were just barely keeping their mouths from saying out loud. Zion set the water glass on the nearest table. He was not going to find Sandra Osai tonight. He understood that now. Tonight had become something else entirely. He started walking steady and straight, the way you walk when you want to look like you have somewhere specific to be instead of like a man who is running out of room. He almost made it to the hallway. The 3 doors at the far end of the ballroom opened at the exact same moment. Not burst open, not forced, just opened all 3 at once, smoothly and simultaneously, as if whatever was coming through them had been waiting for exactly the right second and was now done waiting. 3 men walked in. The room didn't stop, it adjusted. People stepped to the side before they consciously decided to. The way water moves around, something dropped into it. Conversations didn't end, but their volume dropped by an amount that anyone paying attention would have noticed immediately. The one in the center was the tallest, silver-haired, broad through the shoulders. A jaw that looked like it had been set in that position since birth and had never been given a reason to change. He moved without looking at the floor, without scanning the room for reassurance, without any of the small careful signals that people give off when they need to confirm they belong somewhere. He moved like a man who had never once had to be certain, because certainty had been handed to him so early and so completely that he had long ago stopped noticing it was there. His brothers came in on either side of him, both silver-haired, both carrying the same jaw, different in the details that mattered. The one on the left moved faster, his eyes already working over the room in quick systematic passes. The one on the right moved with a controlled stillness that wasn't natural. It was trained, held in place by discipline, the deliberate quiet of someone who understood that silence used correctly was more effective than volume. 3 sets of eyes moved across the ballroom. The one in the center found Zion in under 4 seconds. Zion stopped walking. He didn't know why his feet stopped. Every reasonable part of his body said to keep moving down the hallway, out the exit, into the cold, into a cab, back to Cairo, out of this room and everything it was becoming. But something in the way those eyes landed on him made him stay, because he recognized something in the look he had not been expecting to see. It wasn't rage, it was certainty. And certainty in the eyes of someone that powerful was its own particular brand of terrifying. Rage has edges, and sometimes those edges catch on something real. Certainty has no edges. Certainty arrives already finished with the conversation. Maddox Voss started walking toward him. His brothers followed. And Zion Calloway stood in the middle of a room full of people who had already made up their minds, watching the 3 most powerful men he had ever made the mistake of trusting walk toward him through the gold ballroom light, and understood with the cold clarity that only comes when there is no more room to be wrong that whoever sent that text had planned every second of tonight, the message, the tabloid, the timing. And now the brothers, arriving at the exact right moment to make everything that followed look like justice. Maddox Voss moved through the crowd like the room owed him a path, and the room agreed. He was 6'3", dressed in a black suit that had probably been cut by someone in Milan to fit specifically his body, and he carried around him the particular stillness of a man who had been told he was extraordinary from such an early age that he had never needed to perform it for anyone. He didn't raise his voice when he entered rooms. He didn't look for approval. He simply arrived, and the room reorganized itself accordingly. He stopped 2 feet from Zion, close enough that Zion could see the slight tension in the muscle along his jaw. The only outward signal that whatever was moving through Maddox Voss right now was not as composed as his face was working to make it appear. Knox Voss stopped on Maddox's left. His hands were loose at his sides, but his eyes were already moving over Zion in a systematic way, the way a man moves through data, building something, organizing it, reaching toward a conclusion. Knox ran the analytics arm of Voss Argent Holdings. He had a mind that arranged itself around numbers and patterns. Looking at Zion right now, he was clearly inside a pattern he had already started drawing. Darian Voss took a position on Maddox's right and said nothing. Darian was always the quiet one, and over 8 months inside the Voss network, Zion had come to understand that Maddox's anger and Knox's analysis were both readable things. Darian's silence was not. Quiet men who were already cert were always the ones you couldn't redirect before it was too late. "Where is the child?" Maddox said. Not a question, a demand wearing the shape of one. "Cairo is safe," Zion said. His voice came out level and clear, and the steadiness of it surprised even him. Knox spoke next, measured, precise, and completely without heat, which made it worse than heat would have been. "You accessed our internal financial systems across an 8-month period using credentials tied to your consultancy agreement. You pulled transaction records from the Alaska Trust accounts and flagged withdrawals running through 3 separate holding structures that landed in offshore wallets not registered under any Voss entity. The layering pattern required access to the compliance architecture." He paused. "That's not a mistake, that's a sustained operation." Zion kept his eyes on Maddox. "Someone used my access codes. I didn't." "We have the logs," Darian said, quietly, flatly. "The way a door closes when someone on the other side of it has decided the conversation is over. Someone built those logs," Zion said. "Someone with enough access and enough motive to build them in a way that pointed at me before I could figure out what was actually happening." "What was actually happening?" Maddox said, tilting his head slightly. Zion held his gaze. "Money leaving your Alaska Trust that you didn't authorize and were never meant to find. Someone inside your company has been pulling from your own accounts, running it through shell structures and staging the evidence to land on me. Everything I found is documented. If you'd let me show you where," Knox cut in, "is the documentation. Here, if you give me 2 hours." "We're not giving you 2 hours," Knox said. Around them, the room had settled into the particular focused quiet of 800 people actively pretending not to listen while listening to every word. Women near the flower arrangements had stopped having their own conversations. A man near the bar had his phone angled in their direction in a way that wasn't casual. The tabloid alert was on every screen in the room, and Zion's face on those screens was the same calm face that was standing in this ballroom right now, and the contrast was working against him in a way he could feel but couldn't stop. He looked at all 3 of them, at Maddox's controlled fury, at Knox's systematic certainty, at Darian's absolute stillness, and felt with a clarity that landed like stepping off a curb into empty air that there was no version of this conversation that ended well tonight. They had made a decision before they walked through those doors. Everything happening right now was not an exchange. It was the delivery of a verdict that had already been written. "I'm going to get my nephew," Zion said. "If you want the documentation, contact me in the morning." "We're not contacting you in the morning," Knox said. "Then we're done here," Zion said, and he turned around and walked, not fast, not slow, with the specific steadiness of a man who has decided that the only thing left with any dignity is leaving without running. He moved through the gap between 2 groups of guests. through the door to the left of the main bar, down the corridor that smelled like catering warmth and new carpet, and then through the side exit into the cold. Manhattan air hit him at 42 degrees, and he stood on the sidewalk and pressed the back of his hand against his jaw and just breathed for 5 full seconds. Then Darian's voice came through the closing door behind him, low and unhurried and completely matter-of-fact. "We'll find the boy Calloway." A threat. A statement, the kind that doesn't need the weight of a threat because it is simply what will happen and everyone involved already knows it. Zion walked. He got a cab at the corner and gave across street 2 blocks from the hotel. He texted the babysitter one word, "Pack." He watched his own hands in the darkness of the backseat and let them shake because Cairo wasn't there to see it. He had 20 minutes, maybe 30 if he moved right, the apartment first. The flash drive from the desk drawer, 4 months of documentation he had built carefully and quietly, starting from a withdrawal that hadn't matched any trust mandate and ending somewhere he had not expected to end. Cairo's emergency bag from the closet, his own passport, the folder with Cairo's travel documents. He was back at the hotel in 11 minutes. Cairo was asleep. The babysitter left without questions because Zion had built that understanding carefully over time, and she had always been smart enough to receive it without needing it explained. He stood over Cairo's sleeping body for a moment, 6 years old, small mouth slightly open, one fist pressed into the pillow the way he always slept, as if he was holding something important even in his dreams. Zion picked him up carefully, settled him against his shoulder and walked out of the hotel. Guardia was 40 minutes away. He had cash, he had the drive. He had documentation that, if it reached the right person, would reverse everything, the tabloid story, the accusations, the verdict those 3 brothers had already reached before they walked into the ballroom. What he did not have was certainty about who the right person was, or whether he could reach them before the Voss family reached him. On the plain somewhere over Pennsylvania, Cairo stirred and pressed his face into the side of Zion's neck. "Where are we going?" the boy murmured, still mostly asleep. "Somewhere quiet," Zion said. "Is it safe?" Zion put one hand flat on the back of Cairo's head. "We're going to make it safe." Cairo's breathing evened out again, the full body loosening of a child who has decided the person holding them is enough. That trust settled in Zion's chest like a coal from a stove, warm and heavy and capable of burning if he moved it wrong. The plane cut through the clouds and kept going north. And in Manhattan, far below them, 3 men were already on their phones, already assembling resources, already pointing everything they had toward a point on a map that Zion thought was remote enough to buy him time. He had underestimated how far their reach went. He would find that out before morning. The Voss war room on the 43rd floor was the same temperature as the rest of the building at 3 in the morning, but it always felt colder. Maddox stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking at the Manhattan skyline without actually seeing it. His mind was already somewhere north of the city, already past the grid, already in the dark and the cold and the trees. Knox sat at the long table with 6 screens open in front of him, transaction logs, access histories, travel alerts, digital footprint reports. His coffee sat to his right, untouched. When Knox was working through something that didn't add up, his body dropped to its lowest possible maintenance mode. Food and drink became irrelevant. His mind went all the way in and everything else waited. Darian stood near the door, phone pressed to his ear, saying very little and listening to a great deal. That was Darian's process. Gather everything, confirm everything, and then move once decisively without announcing it ahead of time. Verena Voss sat at the head of the table. She was their father's sister, late 50s, with silver-streaked locks pulled back from a face that had learned many years ago exactly how to look composed under pressure, because composure was a tool and she had always been exceptional with tools. She had run the financial arm of Voss Argent Holdings for 11 years. She had guided the family through 2 market downturns, 3 federal audits, and 1 hostile acquisition attempt that she had dismantled so cleanly the other party had withdrawn without a single public statement. The triplets had grown up watching her work. They trusted her the way you trust the ground you're standing on, not because you have recently tested it, but because it has never once failed you, and at some point you stop thinking about what it would look like if it did. "He boarded a flight to Anchorage at 2:15, Verena said. Her voice carried the even, organized quality of someone who had already assembled the information into sections and was now delivering it in the correct order. "His nephew was with him, no checked luggage." "Go bag," Knox said without looking up. "That would be consistent, yes." Verena folded her hands on the table. "His late mother had a connection to a pack sanctuary north of the city. There's a cabin approximately 60 miles out, remote, no road access past a certain point, not registered in any current public property system. If he knows the terrain well enough, he can get there on foot and it won't appear in a standard location search." "How do you know about the cabin?" Maddox said. It wasn't quite a question. "Do thorough background research on anyone with extended access to our internal financial systems," Verena said. "That's part of how I identified the access pattern anomaly in the first place." Maddox turned from the window. "Walk me through the anomaly again." Verena looked at him with the patient expression of a woman who was very good at repeating things to powerful people who needed to hear them more than once. The Alaska Trust accounts showed a pattern of small withdrawals over 16 weeks, totaling approximately $12 million across 6 holding structures. Each withdrawal was sized to stay below automatic reporting thresholds, but the structure required access to the internal compliance architecture. That level of access was limited to senior financial consultants, the compliance director, the CFO, and the three of you on an emergency override basis. She paused precisely. The access timestamps correlate to periods when Zion Calloway was confirmed inside the building. Else could have built the structure that cleanly, Knox said. Someone with the same level of access, Verena said. But the logs don't support that reading. The logs support Calloway. Darian came off his phone and walked to the table and sat. I can have someone in Anchorage by dawn, clean and quiet. Drive comes back, the situation closes, no further exposure. No one else, Maddox said. We go. Maddox, Knox started. He was inside our systems for 8 months. Maddox's voice was controlled by something that was working hard. He was at our table, he was in this building. He used access we gave him and trust we built over time, and the entire period he was running a parallel operation. If we hand that to someone else and they miss something or make a decision we don't sanction, he stopped. We go. Knox held his gaze for a moment, then he looked back at his screens. That was the specific Knox Voss version of registering a disagreement, meeting your eyes, saying nothing, returning to work. It meant he had calculated the odds of changing the outcome and decided they weren't worth the energy. Verena stood. She smoothed the front of her blazer, a small, finished gesture, the gesture of a woman who had said what she needed to say and was now stepping aside to let things move. I'll handle legal coordination from here. The compliance team will have a public statement ready if the tabloid story runs wider in the morning cycle. She looked at Maddox. When you recover the drive, bring it to me directly before it goes anywhere else. I need to assess what exactly was copied and in what context before we decide how to handle the disclosure question. Understood, Maddox said. She walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft, complete click. None of the brothers watched her go. They were already looking at screens. Already thinking about Anchorage. Already building the mental map of how the next 24 hours would move. They should have watched. Because Verena Voss walked out of that room with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who has just watched something she arranged begin moving in exactly the direction she intended, and is now stepping to a comfortable distance, while the people she is most connected to stand at the center of it, and believe completely that they are the ones directing it. At 5:45 in the morning, the Voss private jet lifted off from Teterboro. Below them, Manhattan was still mostly dark, just the first gray edge of dawn pressing up at the eastern horizon above Brooklyn. Maddox watched it for a minute and then stopped watching. He thought about the ballroom. He thought about Zion Calloway standing under 800 pairs of eyes with everything already moving against him, and holding still. Not playing innocent in the loud, desperate way guilty people sometimes do. Not performing shock. Just standing there level-eyed, saying clearly and without any visible fear, I did not steal from you. He thought about the specific quality of that stillness. Then he thought about $12 million moving through 6 holding structures in 16 weeks. He thought about access logs with timestamps. He thought about the 8 months Zion had spent inside the network with full access to the compliance architecture. He put the stillness out of his mind. He had been taken in by a calm face and a quiet voice before, years back, in a situation that had cost the company significantly. He had made himself a clear promise after that. What someone looks like under pressure is not evidence of what they actually did. Numbers were evidence. Knox slept across the aisle. Darian had his eyes closed and his headphones on. The jet moved into Canadian airspace and kept climbing north. 4 hours later, the wheels touched down at Anchorage International, and when the door opened, the cold that came in was nothing like city cold. It didn't negotiate. It came through the gap in the door, walked through every layer of coat and clothing, and settled into the bones like it had always intended to stay there. Maddox stepped onto the tarmac and looked north. Trees. Miles of dark, dense trees going on past anything visible. A sky the color of old concrete, flat and low and holding no promises. Somewhere in there, Zion Calloway was hiding with a 6-year-old child and a flash drive that certain people were not going to be allowed to deliver to anyone. Maddox buttoned his coat to the collar and walked toward the vehicle. He had made his decision. He was going to go into those trees, find Zion Calloway, recover what belonged to the Voss family, and close this before it cost them anything beyond what it already had. He had no way of knowing yet that the most expensive thing in this entire situation was not on a flash drive. It was 60 miles north in a small cabin, sitting on a table under a lamp, waiting quietly for someone to actually open it and read what it said. The fire in the iron stove had been going for 2 hours and the cabin was still not fully warm. Zion crouched in front of it, feeding another split log into the flames, listening to the wood catch. The cabin held heat slowly, thick walls, small windows, construction that had been built to survive conditions that had no interest in making things comfortable for the people inside. His mother had loved this place. She had called it the only room that was completely honest because it was either warm or it wasn't, and there was no middle ground. Cairo was in the back room. The boy's fever had started somewhere over Canada and climbed steadily through the descent into Anchorage and the last mile on foot through the snow. By the time they reached the cabin, Cairo had been leaning almost all his weight into Zion's side, his forehead warm and his eyes glassy with the particular unfocused look that fevers put on children, present enough to follow instructions, not present enough to be fully anywhere. The boy was wrapped in both blankets now, his scarf loose at his neck, his small boots drying against the far wall. The flash drive sat on the table under the lamp. Zion had put it there deliberately when they arrived, out in the open under the light where he could see it from anywhere in the front room. It was smaller than his thumb. Inside it was 4 months of documentation that had started as a simple question about numbers that didn't match and had turned, by the time he understood what he was actually looking at, into something that put a specific cold in his chest that the stove could not reach. He had not gone looking for anything beyond routine work. He had been doing quarterly reconciliation on the Alaska Trust accounts, standard cross-checking, disbursements against original trust mandates, when he found the first withdrawal that didn't fit. $12,000 through a holding company he had never seen referenced in any prior documentation. He flagged it internally and kept moving, then he found another one, then 5 more. Then when he went deeper into the structure, he found something that was not an accident and was not a series of accidents but was instead a pattern, layered and deliberate, and built by someone who understood the compliance architecture well enough to know exactly where the automatic alert stopped looking, and how long things could move before anything tripped. When he finally found the name tied to the accounts the money was landing in, he sat in his office chair for a long time without moving. It was not a stranger's name, it was not someone external to the company. Not a third party with a financial angle, not an outside actor who had found an entry point. It was someone the triplets would never look at, someone they trusted completely and had trusted for so long that the trust had become structural, built into how the company operated at every level, which was exactly why it had worked for as long as it had. He had copied everything he could find, built the documentation carefully in layers, cross-referenced and time-stamped. He had been 3 days from reaching his contact at the SEC whistleblower office when the tabloid story ran, and he had understood immediately what that meant. Whoever was behind this had known he was looking. They had moved first. They needed him discredited and unreachable before he could hand the documentation to anyone with the authority to use it. The text from the unknown number. The tabloid alert timed to hit every phone in that ballroom at exactly the right moment. The Voss brothers already on their way, none of that had been coincidence. Cairo coughed from the back room. Zion got up and went through the doorway. The boy was half propped on one elbow, his eyes still carrying the glassy quality of the fever but clearer than an hour ago. Zion pressed the back of his hand to Cairo's forehead. Better, not good yet, but moving in the right direction. Do you feel? Zion asked. My head hurts, Cairo said. I know, drink some more water. He handed the boy the cup from the side table. You're getting better, the fever's coming down. Cairo drank, then with the particular directness that 6-year-olds have because they haven't learned yet that some questions are supposed to be softened first, he asked. Are we in trouble? Zion looked at him for a moment. He had a rule about this, a rule he had made early after the boy's mother died and after the string of adults in Cairo's life had handed him promises that went exactly nowhere. The rule was that Zion did not lie to Cairo. Not because children needed to know everything, they didn't, but because Cairo had been lied to by enough people in his short life that one more comfortable untruth had the potential to do damage that couldn't be undone later with honesty. We're in a complicated situation, Zion said, and I'm working on getting us out of it, but right now in this room you are safe. Cairo studied his face for a second in the careful way that children study faces when they are checking whether the words match the expression. Then he lay back down. Okay, he said, that single word, handed over with that much trust, settled in Zion's chest like a stone dropped into still water, felt long after it landed. He went back to the front room. He stood at the window and looked out at the tree line 200 yards across the snow. The sky was flat gray, Alaskan midday light, the kind that came without any warmth attached to it. Nothing moved out there, just white and shadow and the dark line of trees at the far edge of the clearing. He turned back to the table, picked up the flash drive, turned it in his fingers once, set it down. 3 days. He needed 3 more days and the right phone call. His contact, a former professor who now consulted with the SEC's whistleblower division, had agreed in principle to meet. He just needed to reach him before Verena Voss could reach whoever she was about to reach. The snow outside made a sound, one sound, small. The compression of a boot coming down on frozen crust, sharp and brief and then completely gone. Zion went still. He moved to the window from the side, keeping his body against the wall, angling his face to see through the frost-rimmed glass without being visible from the outside. He looked at the field of snow between the cabin and the tree line, white, still. Gray shadow at the edges. He waited. 30 seconds passed. He exhaled slowly and started to turn back toward the table. Then Cairo coughed once in the back room, just one cough, small and wet, and Zion turned toward the sound automatically, the way adults turn toward children without deciding to, and when he turned back to the window the tree line was different. The spaces between the trees had shapes in them, dark and straight and absolutely still. Not the stillness of animals. Animals move, even cautious ones, even waiting ones. These shapes did not move at all. They held position with the particular motionlessness of people who have been trained to wait without shifting their weight, without adjusting their footing, without showing the cold in any way their bodies could avoid showing it. 3 of them, one in the center. Taller than the others, Zion stepped back from the window. He moved fast and quiet to the back room. Cairo was already half sitting up, drawn by some instinct toward Zion's silence. Put your coat on, Zion said, low, even. Right now, both arms. Cairo reached for his coat without arguing. Zion shoved the flash drive into the inside pocket of his own coat. He grabbed the satchel from beside the table, Cairo's medication, their documents, his phone, and slung it across his body. He moved back through the front room toward the rear door. He was 3 feet from it when the front door opened, not kicked. Not broken, just opened, Cold air came in first, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees in under 2 seconds. Then Maddox Voss filled the doorway, dark coat, snow at his shoulders, breath visible in the cold. He ducked his head slightly to clear the frame and straightened inside the cabin, and he seemed to take up more space than the room should have been able to hold. Knox came in behind him. Then Darian, who turned and pulled the door shut with the quiet, deliberate care of a man establishing that there was now one way in and one way out, and both ran through the same point. Maddox looked at Zion. Then at Cairo, standing in the doorway between the rooms, one arm through his coat and one still out, his face doing the thing that children's faces do when they are frightened and trying to take their cue from the adult they trust most. Then back at Zion. "Give us the drive," he said. Zion stepped left one step, putting himself between Cairo and the three brothers without making it look like a defensive move, just a shift in position. His hands were loose at his sides. His breathing was even. He looked at Maddox directly, not performing calm, not performing courage. Just steady, the way a person can only be steady when they have nothing left to manage and nothing left to lose, and the only thing remaining is the truth as they know it. "Been lied to," Zion said. "Not by me. By someone inside your own company who needed you looking at me so you wouldn't look at them. Everything on that drive proves it. Every transaction, every timestamp, every name. If you take it without reading it, you're finishing the work they started." Maddox held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he nodded once, not in agreement, but in the flat way a man nods when he has heard something and decided it does not change what happens next. He said one word: "Knox." And the next 3 seconds happened very fast. Knox moved left. He cut toward the satchel on the floor beside the table, fast and low, both hands reaching before Zion had fully processed the direction. Zion twisted right faster than any of them expected, because fear at a high enough level does something to the body that training alone cannot replicate, and swept the satchel up from the floor in one motion, pulling it against his chest. Knox's fingers caught the strap and held. They pulled against each other. Zion had 30 pounds on Knox, but Knox had leverage, both hands locked on the strap, his body angled low. For 2 full seconds they were locked, the satchel between them, the table behind Knox, the rear door behind Zion, Cairo pressed flat against the back wall of the doorway with his coat half on and his eyes enormous. Zion released the strap. Knox stumbled backward, the satchel going with him, and Zion used the 2-step gap of distance to get around the left side of the table and put it between himself and Maddox, who was already moving from the right. "Stay against the wall," Zion said to Cairo, sharp and low. Cairo pressed himself flat against the wood and did not make a sound. Maddox came around the right end of the table and got a hand on Zion's shoulder, not a grab, a grip, the kind of grip backed by a body that understood physical leverage at a level beyond technique. The force of it traveled from Zion's shoulder down through his spine, a spreading pressure that would have driven a smaller person directly to the floor. He did not go to the floor. He dropped his weight low and twisted into the grip instead of away from it, turning his body in the direction the force was already moving, using its momentum against itself. His mother had shown him this once, right here in this cabin, years ago. On a cold afternoon that had felt like nothing at the time and now felt like preparation. Don't pull from strength, use the direction. For 1 full second, Maddox's grip slipped. Zion hit the rear door with his shoulder and drove it open. Cold air crashed over him, snow under his boots. He reached back through the open doorway, got both hands on the satchel Knox was still holding, and threw it hard and wide out into the snow, watching it tumble and skid across the ice and come to rest 20 feet from the tree line. "Cairo, stay down," he shouted back through the door. Darian came out of the cabin behind him, moving fast. He caught Zion across the jaw with a flat-palmed strike, controlled, not a punch but a redirection, designed to stun and stop forward movement rather than drop. It worked. Zion's head snapped left, white light cracked across his vision, and his boots skidded in the snow as he stumbled 2 steps to the right. He did not stop, his jaw was screaming. His vision had an unsteady bright edge running through it. He got his feet under him and went for the tree line anyway, because the tree line was the only geography that offered anything cover distance, the ability to turn and come back from a direction they weren't covering. He got 4 steps. Maddox caught him from behind both arms, locking Zion's against his own body, lifting his heels a half-inch off the snow. Zion drove his elbow straight back into Maddox's ribs. Hard, felt the grip loosen by a fraction, drove again and again. The grip was starting to give when Knox came in from the left side and got 2 fingers into the inside pocket of Zion's coat, reaching for the drive. Zion made a decision in half a second. He got his right hand free from Maddox's loosening grip, reached into his own inside pocket before Knox's fingers could close around the drive, and pulled it out himself. He turned his wrist and threw it as hard as he could, not toward the satchel, not in any direction they were watching, but right and deep, into the snow past the far edge of the clearing where the drift was high, and the light was gray and nothing could be seen clearly from standing height. It disappeared into the white without a sound. "You want it," Zion said, breathing hard, his voice carrying clear through the cold air. "You're going to have to look for it." Maddox's expression shifted, not into rage. Maddox was past the temperature of rage, into something colder and more focused and more permanent. He released his hold on Zion and stepped back half a step, and for one moment, one single mistaken moment, Zion thought the situation was slowing down. Darien stepped in from the right. He drove a forearm straight into Zion's chest, the full force of a man who had decided the situation needed to end right now. There was no misdirection in it and no warning. Zion went backward. His heels caught the edge of a root buried just beneath the snow's surface, and his body went sideways as it fell, turning in the half-second before impact so that it was not his back that came down but his left side, his shoulder, and then his head. His head came down on something buried under 2 inches of packed snow, something that did not move, did not absorb impact, did not give a single millimeter in any direction. Stone. Cold and flat and completely fixed in the frozen ground beneath the surface. The sound it made was small. That was the thing every one of them registered first in the fraction of a second after it happened. Not the force of the impact, not the speed, but the smallness of the sound. A small sound. The sound of something that mattered ending very quietly, the way important things sometimes do when there is nobody ready for them. Zion went still. He didn't reach for the ground to catch himself. His arms didn't move. He went completely, absolutely still in the snow, face turned to the side, eyes closed, one arm extended above his head where the momentum had carried it, the other folded at an angle his body would not have chosen for itself. At his left temple, through his hair and against the snow beneath him, blood began to spread slow, red against the white, moving outward from a single point. The 3 brothers stood in the snow around him, none of them moved. The clearing held the kind of silence that arrives in the half-second after something irreversible, the silence that forms before the mind finishes catching up to what the eyes have just shown it. The silence of a breath that nobody consciously decided to hold. Then Karo's voice came through the open cabin door, small, cracked at the edges, breaking in the specific way that a child's voice breaks when they see something enormous and have no frame in their understanding to contain it. Hurt him. And then, after 1 second, please. Maddox turned toward the sound. Cairo was standing in the open doorway, one arm still not through his coat sleeve, his scarf half unwound at the neck, his face completely wet. His eyes moved from the blood in the snow to Maddox's face, and then back to the blood, and he did not look away and he did not stop crying, and he did not move any closer because he was 6 years old and he understood, without being able to name it, that something had just happened that his crying was not big enough to fix. There are moments when the thing you believed you were doing, and the thing you were actually doing become 2 completely different things in the space of one clear look. Knox's hands opened at his sides. He looked at Zion lying in the snow and then he looked away, and there was nothing in the way he looked away that resembled composure. It was something much rawer than composure. Something that composure is built specifically to cover. Darien turned in a slow half circle and stopped because the tree line was different. It had eyes in it, blue eyes burning in the flat gray light. Not 1 pair, not 5. 2 pairs became 4, and then there was no clean count anymore because they were appearing in the spaces between the trees the way stars come up when your eyes fully adjust to the dark. Not arriving exactly, but revealing themselves, making visible what had always been there. What the darkness had always been holding, patient and still and completely aware of everything that had happened in this clearing. Wolves, 40 of them at minimum. They stood in a ring that was already complete, north edge of the clearing, east-west, all the spaces between filled in until the tree line was no longer a boundary between the open ground and the forest, but a living wall of gray and black and white fur, blue eyes and breath rising in slow white clouds in the cold air. They did not advance, they did not make sound, they did not need to do either of those things. They waited the way things wait when they are absolutely certain they have already won. Then the pack parted down the center. From the deepest place between the trees, a figure came forward through the snow. He did not hurry. His stride was long and steady and unhurried in the way of someone who has never once needed to rush because the conclusion was never going to change regardless of the pace he set getting there. The wolves on either side of him shifted to make room, not from training but from something older than training, from recognition, the automatic reorganizing of a space around the thing in it that holds the most authority. He was tall. Taller than any of the triplets and broader through the shoulders than the wolfskin coat made visible until he was close. The coat moved around him in the cold air like it was still part of something living. His hair was silver-braided past his shoulders. His face had the quality of things shaped over long years by serious conditions, not old in a way that meant diminished, but permanent in the way that certain landscapes are permanent. The way the mountain behind this clearing was permanent, there before you arrived and there long after. His eyes, when they moved slowly. He stopped 10 feet from where Zion lay in the snow. He looked at the blood at Zion's temple. He looked at it for a long time, not with shock, not with rage. With the specific quality of attention that belongs to someone who is making certain they're seeing exactly what they are seeing before they respond to it. Then he raised his eyes to Maddox Voss, held them there, then Knox, then Darien. He looked at each of them in turn, and what he gave them was not anger and not grief and not the pointed performance of threat. It was something quieter than all of those things, and because it was quieter, it hit harder. When he spoke, his voice was just above a whisper, the kind of voice that carries not by being loud but by being the only sound in a space that has gone completely still around it. You struck him, he said. On protected ground. Maddox Voss had been in rooms with senators. He had sat across from federal prosecutors and hostile attorneys, and men who had tried to dismantle the Voss empire through legal means and failed. He had never once, in his adult life, felt the specific quality of cold that moved through him in the moment those 7 words landed in the clearing. It was not fear of the man. It was the recognition of something he could not negotiate, could not outmaneuver, and could not redirect with money or access or the weight of the Voss name. It was the recognition of a situation that had already resolved itself without requiring his input. Knox's hands stayed open at his sides. Darien said nothing. His jaw was tight and his eyes were on the ring of wolves, and he did not move. Cairo ran. He came out of the cabin doorway and crossed the snow at a full run and dropped to his knees beside Zion and pressed both small hands flat against Zion's chest. Not pressing hard, not trying to wake him, just placing his hands there the way you place something precious down in the one spot where you believe it will be kept safe. His face was pressed close and his whole body was shaking. "Help him," Cairo said. He looked up at the man in the wolfskin coat. "Please, please help him." Zaire Thorne, keeper of the Northern Sanctuary, the one name that appeared in a single paragraph of a single Voss legal risk assessment under the heading Entities Not to Be Engaged Without Extraordinary Preparation and Considerable Caution, looked at the 6-year-old boy kneeling in the red snow over the unconscious man. Then he looked at the 3 brothers, one at a time, with the same slow, complete attention, and he spoke 4 more words, soft, unhurried, absolute. "You will carry him." A request. Not a warning, an instruction given by someone who had already decided how this ended and was simply waiting for the rest of the clearing to arrive at the same understanding. The 40 wolves did not advance. No teeth. No sound. No display of the force they very clearly possessed in quantities that did not require demonstration, just the ring, just the blue eyes. Just the white breath rising in the cold air over the motionless body of Zion Calloway, and the boy refusing to lift his hands from his uncle's chest, and 3 men, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, built from generations of wealth and the unquestioned, understanding that their reach extended wherever they chose to point it, standing in the Alaskan snow, and understanding for the first time in their lives what it felt like to be the smallest thing in the clearing, not because the wolves were larger. Not because Zaire Thorne was more powerful, but because they had looked at what they had done, and for the first time there was no story they could build around it in which they were not fully responsible for it. No context, no complexity, just a man bleeding in the snow, a child's hands on his chest, and 40 witnesses who had seen every second and forgot nothing. Maddox Voss went down on one knee in the snow. The cold came through his coat at the knee immediately, full and uncompromising. Knox knelt beside him, then Darien, and in the gray Alaskan dawn, with the wolves standing in their ring and Zaire Thorne watching with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything, the 3 most powerful men in American private finance knelt in the blood-stained snow beside the man they had broken and began slowly, without a word between them, to understand that power without restraint is not strength. It is just damage that hasn't finished arriving yet. They would carry him. And the weight of that, the physical weight of his body, yes, but the other weight, the kind that doesn't leave when you set someone down, would be the thing they carried long after the snow had melted and the wolves had gone back into the trees. Because some things you do cannot be undone, they can only be answered for, and the answer, it turned out, started here, in the cold, on their knees. With 40 pairs of eyes watching every second and a child still waiting for someone to tell him the man he loved was going to be okay, Maddox Voss had never carried anyone in his life, not in the sense that mattered. He had carried companies. He had carried decisions that moved hundreds of millions of dollars and shifted the employment futures of thousands of people. He had carried the weight of the Voss name since he was old enough to understand what it meant and what it demanded and what it would cost him if he handled it wrong. He had been built, across 34 years, into a man who held things up, not a man who bent down and lifted them from the ground. He bent now. He got his arms under Zion Calloway's shoulders and knees, and he lifted, and the weight that came with it was not only the weight of a man's body, 170-something pounds, lean and still and completely unresisting, but the weight of the specific silence that had settled over the clearing since the moment Zion's head came down on that stone. A silence that pressed on the back of the neck. A silence that understood exactly what had happened and was not going to forget it. Knox walked on the left side, Darien on the right. None of them spoke. Zaire Thorne moved ahead of them through the snow, parting the path. The wolves shifted in the tree line as the small group crossed the clearing, not following exactly but keeping pace, their blue eyes tracking steadily through the dark gap between the trunks. Cairo ran 2 steps ahead of Maddox's left knee, glancing back every few seconds at Zion's face the way children look at the thing they are most afraid of losing. Not constantly, because constant looking is for people who still need to convince themselves, but regularly, the checking of someone who is holding themselves together by very thin discipline. There was a second structure 60 yards past the tree line, not a cabin. Larger. Built into the hillside, half covered by the slope, made from the same dark timber as everything else in this part of Alaska, but assembled with the kind of precision that said it had been here long before any of the people now approaching it. Zaire pushed the door open and held it, and Maddox carried Zion through. Inside, the warmth was immediate and old and entirely different from the thin warmth of the small stove in the cabin. This was the warmth of a space that had been maintained at temperature for a long time by something that understood cold the way people who were born to it understand cold, not as an enemy, but as a condition that requires a specific patient response. Maddox laid Zion on the long bench near the far wall. A woman appeared from the back room, not young, not old, moving with the particular economy of someone whose every action has been stripped of anything unnecessary. She carried a basin, a cloth, supplies he could not name. She looked at Zion once and then at the three brothers with an expression that did not speak. It communicated. There was a significant difference, and all three of them felt it. She worked on the wound at Zion's temple without any ceremony. Cairo sat on the floor beside the bench. He pulled his knees up to his chest and rested his chin on them and watched the woman's hands move. He had stopped crying. What was in his face now was the specific dry exhaustion of a child who has used everything they had and arrived on the other side of it not in peace, but in the place past peace. The bare, open place where there are no more reactions left to give and the only thing left to do is wait. Zaire stood at the center of the room. He did not sit. He looked at each of the brothers in turn, and then he looked at the flash drive sitting in Maddox's coat pocket, its outline visible through the fabric, small and rectangular, and carrying the specific gravity of things that hold the difference between what people believe and what is actually true. He found it 4 months ago, Zaire said. His voice in the enclosed space carried differently than it had in the open air of the clearing, quieter and more complete. He came to me 6 weeks before the gala. He needed documentation advice from someone outside your network, someone your family could not reach. Maddox's eyes moved to him. He came to you. Came to me, Zaire said. He showed me what he had found, all of it. He paused. I told him to go to the federal whistleblower office. He told me he needed 3 more days to verify the final transfer layer before the documentation was complete enough to be unimpeachable. He was 2 days from that point when the tabloid story ran. Rooms shifted, not physically, but in the way rooms shift when everyone in them simultaneously processes a piece of information and arrives at its consequence before anyone says it out loud. Knox turned very slowly toward Maddox. Darian turned at the same time, and in the meeting of their eyes across that room, above the unconscious body of Zion Calloway. Below the waiting eyes of 40 wolves visible through the window glass in the dark tree line outside, something passed between the 3 brothers that was not a word and did not need to be. The tabloid story had run at 10:43 at night, precisely timed. At exactly the moment that would deliver the maximum number of connected, powerful witnesses in a single room, confirm the accusation publicly before Zion could respond, and redirect the Voss family's attention entirely toward Zion, away from the thing Zion was 2 days from fully documenting. The woman cleaning Zion's wound wrung the cloth into the basin. The water in the basin went pink. Cairo looked at it and then looked at the ceiling and swallowed. Who knew? Darian said. Not a question, a sentence someone speaks when they have already started assembling the answer and are saying it out loud to hear where the pieces land. Who had the access, Knox said. Who had the financial architecture knowledge? Who could build logs clean enough to pass our internal review? Who had the motive? Who would understand exactly how to direct the 3 of us? He stopped, he looked at the floor. Who knew we would come here? Room held the answer, nobody said it yet. Because once you say a name like that out loud in a room like this one, once you put language to the particular shape of a betrayal that runs that deep and that long, it cannot be unsaid. And all 3 of them, without discussing it, were standing at the edge of that moment, understanding that what came after the name would be a world that looked different from every angle than the world they had known this morning. Maddox pulled the flash drive from his inside coat pocket. He held it in his palm. He looked at it. Then he looked at Zaire Thorne. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Gear looked at him for a long, measured moment. Then he sat down across the table, folded his hands on the wood, and began. Outside, the wolves stood in the tree line, blue eyes open in the cold, watching the structure where the light burned steady and the truth, patient and precise and entirely ready, was finally being allowed into the room. Knox had the drive open and running on his laptop in under 3 minutes. He said nothing while it loaded. He did not make preliminary observations. He did not summarize while the files were still organizing on the screen, the way people who are good at managing information sometimes do to demonstrate that they are good at managing information. He simply read. His eyes moved across the screen with the specific speed of a man whose mind operates several levels faster than the display can keep up with. And the only outward sign that what he was reading was significant was the stillness he went into, the total, absolute stillness of a person whose body has been asked to stop contributing anything to the world for a moment, so the mind can do what it needs to do without interruption. Maddox stood at the window. He had positioned himself so he could see the room and the drive and Knox's face from one point, and he watched Knox's face the way you watch a weather system develop when you are standing in an open field with nowhere to go, tracking the changes before they arrive, already calculating what they mean. Darian sat at the table with his phone on the wood in front of him, face down. He had not touched it in 11 minutes. For Darian, an untouched phone was the equivalent of a different man packing the length of a room. Zion was awake. He had come back to consciousness 14 minutes ago in the specific incremental way people come back from head injuries, not all at once, not with a clear return, but in layers, each one settling a little more than the one before. The woman had confirmed he was concussed. No fracture she could identify from external examination, but he needed real medical evaluation and he needed to stay flat, and he needed to not move quickly for a number of hours that she named and he immediately tried to ignore, which she had apparently anticipated because she had looked at him once in a way that made him stop trying. Cairo was beside him, one hand pressed flat against Zion's arm. The boy had fallen asleep in the chair pulled up next to the bench, his head tipped sideways at the angle that only children and people completely destroyed by exhaustion can sustain without being uncomfortable. His small chest rose and fell steadily. Zion watched the three brothers from the bench without saying anything. He had watched Knox insert the drive. He had watched the screen fill with files. He had watched Maddox go to the window and Darian go still at the table. He watched all of this with the particular quality of a person who has spent a long time being the only one in a room who understood the full picture and is now, for the first time, not alone in that understanding. The first transfer was 17 months ago, Knox said. His voice came out flat and level and completely without inflection, the way Knox's voice came out when he was delivering something that required absolutely no additional processing on the listener's end, because the weight of the information was already doing all the work it needed to do. 12,000 to a holding company registered in Delaware, unincorporated entity, no public officers listed. The parent account is a Voss Argent subsidiary under the Alaska Land Trust umbrella. He paused. The access credentials that authorized the transfer belong to Verena, nobody breathed. The second and third transfers show the same credentials. The fourth has a layer. The credentials route through a ghost consultant entry that was created 6 months into Callaway's contract. His name is on the entry. His access codes are attached. But the entry was created at 2:47 in the morning, and the building access logs for that date show Callaway arrived at 9:12 and departed at 6:44 the same day. Knox looked up from the screen. Callaway did not create that entry. Someone with administrative override access created it during off hours and backdated the timestamp. Administrative override, Maddox said from the window. 3 people have that level in the system, Knox said. Compliance director who has been with the company for 2 years. You and Verena. The room absorbed this. Darian picked up his phone from the table. He did not make a call. He checked the screen, turned it face down again, and looked at the far wall. The total movement, Knox said. Across all transfer layers, all holding structures, all time-stamped over the 17-month period and cross-referenced with the trust ledgers in here. He paused. 1.4 billion. The number sat in the room. $1.4 billion, not the 12 million the internal investigation had surfaced, not the amount that had been presented to the triplets as the scope of the damage. 1.4 billion, moved in patient, careful, perfectly sized increments over 17 months by a person who understood the system so completely that she had built the system, and had therefore known from the beginning exactly where every blind spot was and how long she could use them before she needed to move to the next one. Zion spoke from the bench. His voice was quiet and slightly rough from the concussion, but it was clear. The final transfer layer, the one that doesn't appear in the main ledger, runs through a nonprofit registered in New Jersey, conservation funding. The public filing shows it as a land trust grant, but the money doesn't go to land. It routes through 2 shell accounts and lands in an offshore account under a name I couldn't match to anyone inside or attached to your company. He stopped, letting the room catch up. I found the name 3 weeks ago. I needed one more verification pass before I could confirm the connection. That's why I needed 2 more days. Whose name? Maddox said. Armand Pelletier, Zion said. He's a private wealth consultant based in Geneva. His client list is not public, but his name appears on the incorporation documents for 4 of the 6 shell structures in the chain. He held Maddox's gaze. He has been Verena's personal financial advisor for 11 years. Maddox turned fully from the window. He looked at Zion Callaway, lying on a bench in a remote Alaskan structure, concussed, one eye slightly swollen, blood dried at his temple that the woman had cleaned but that the skin still showed, and he made himself hold that look without moving through it too fast, without going directly to the next action or the next decision. Because Maddox Voss had been moving from action to action his entire life, and right now he needed to stop and be in this room with what was in front of him. This man had found the truth, had built the documentation carefully, methodically, correctly, had done the work that the Voss family's own internal systems had missed or had been built to miss. Had come within 48 hours of delivering everything needed to end it cleanly and legally. And then the 3 of them had come into a clearing in the Alaskan wilderness and put him on the ground. Darian stood up from the table. He walked to the bench where Zion lay and stood there for a moment. Then he did something that no one in the room had seen Darian Voss do in any room, in any year, in any situation that any of them could bring to mind. He knelt on the cold floor, both knees. Eye level with the man on the bench, he did not speak immediately. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at Zion's face. We were directed to you, Darian said. Every piece of information we received about the leak was shaped to make us see you. We moved the way she needed us to move. We said the things she needed us to say in the places she needed them said in front of the witnesses she needed present. He stopped. And when that wasn't enough to finish it, she gave us your location. Zion was quiet. She told you where the cabin was, he said. She told us, Darian said. She framed it as thorough background research. He met Zion's eyes. It wasn't. Cairo stirred slightly in the chair and settled back into sleep. Zaire stood near the door watching. The 40 wolves outside had not moved. They stood in the cold with the patience of things that have agreed to wait and intend to honor that agreement fully, and their blue eyes in the dark outside the window were the only light in the tree line. Knox pulled out his phone. I'm calling the federal office, he said. Tonight, the documentation is complete. It was complete before we got on that plane. He stood up from the table. We owe her nothing, we owe him everything. He did not look at Maddox for permission. He dialed. Maddox stood in the center of the room between the man they had broken and the window where the wolves watched. And he understood, with the full cold weight of it landing in his chest all at once, that the most powerful thing he had built in his life, the certainty that his judgment was reliable, that his read on people was accurate, that the Voss family's internal trust structures were sound, had been the exact instrument used to destroy an innocent man. The phone call connected. Knox began to speak. And outside in the dark, Verena Voss was boarding a private car at Anchorage International, her overnight bag in the seat beside her, her phone in her hand, already composing the next step, not yet aware that the step she needed had already been taken by someone else, 40 minutes ago, in a structure 60 yards past a tree line she had never once factored into her planning. The wolves knew before she did. By 4 in the morning, the cabin had 3 federal contacts on 2 different phones and a complete digital transfer of every file on the drive going to a secure government server. Zion watched it happen from the bench. He watched Knox work, organized, precise, thorough in the way of a man whose mind is built for exactly this kind of pressure. And he watched Maddox on the phone in the corner with his back to the room, speaking in the flat, clipped sentences of someone who is delivering information they do not want to be delivering, but who has decided that delivery is no longer optional. He watched Darian, who had gotten up from the floor and now stood near the door doing what Darian apparently did when the situation had passed beyond his ability to control it. He stood still and he stayed present and he did not try to manage anything. Cairo slept through all of it. That was the thing that kept coming back to Zion as the hours moved, that the boy could sleep. That whatever part of a child's nervous system is in charge of deciding when the worst is over had made that call and allowed Cairo's body to release into the full unconscious rest that 6-year-olds go into like they fall off ledges, completely and without return until they are ready. His breathing was even. His face in sleep had the openness that it carried in the mornings before the world had had time to put anything on it. Zion reached over and rested his hand on Cairo's knee, barely touching, just enough weight to know it was there. The woman had given him something for the pain in his head. Not enough. But he didn't ask for more because he wanted his thinking clear for whatever came next. What came next arrived at 5:17. Knox's contact at the Federal Whistleblower Division had flagged the filing immediately. Not because the amount was surprising, though the amount was significant even by the standards of investigations that dealt in significant amounts, but because the name attached to the originating accounts was already connected to an ongoing inquiry. A separate federal investigation, separate jurisdiction that had been building its own case around a set of offshore account structures linked to private wealth consulting in Europe. Armand Pelletier was not a new name to certain offices. He was a very old name in certain offices. He had simply never been connected to anything domestic at scale before tonight. The Voss connection changed the size of the thing considerably. Knox relayed this to his brothers with a directness that had no space in it for anything except the information itself. Maddox listened, then he said, "Where is she now?" Knox checked his screen. "Anchorage Airport. She booked a connection to Vancouver at 4:40. Can they stop her at the gate?" Darian said. "Already requested." Knox said. There was a pause. "She's going to know," Maddox said. "The moment she gets stopped at the gate, she's going to know we went to the federal office. She has attorneys. She'll have them on the phone in under 3 minutes, Knox said. She'll claim the documentation is fabricated, Maddox said. She'll argue that Calloway built it as a frame. She spent 4 months building a public record of his alleged access pattern. She has that to work with, does, Knox said. And we have everything on the drive. We have 17 months of layered transfers. We have the administrative override logs showing her credentials creating the ghost entry at 2:47 in the morning. We have the Pelletier connection. We have Calloway's original access timestamps demonstrating he was not in the building when the ghost entry was created. He met Maddox's eyes. And we have the 3 of us. Room held that last part for a moment. Maddox looked at his brother. We contradicted him in public, at the gala, in front of 800 people. The tabloid story has our names attached to the confirmation. If we reverse, Knox said steadily, we are 3 principals of the company that was defrauded, confirming that the man accused of the fraud was in fact the person who discovered it and documented it at personal risk. The credibility runs toward the correction, not away from it, because the correction comes from us. He stopped. We have to be the ones who say it, loudly. First, Darian spoke from the door. Then say it. Just that 3 words, landing with the weight of his usual silence behind them, and both brothers looked at him and understood that Darian had reached the end of his capacity to wait for the right conditions, and was simply telling them that the right conditions were not coming and they needed to move. Maddox pulled out his phone. He drafted a statement in 17 minutes. He sent it to the Voss Argent Holdings public communications account at 5:41 in the morning, with a full copy to the same media contact who had published the original tabloid story, and a simultaneous filing notice attached to the federal documents Knox had just completed transferring. The statement named Verena, it named the accounts, it named the amount. And it named Zion Calloway, not as a subject of any action, but as the individual whose documentation had made the investigation possible, and whose safety the Voss family accepted full responsibility for failing to protect. That last sentence, 17 words that Maddox had written and then deleted and then written again, sat in the statement like the most expensive thing he had ever committed to, because it was the only one that could not be walked back later. Everything else in the statement was facts and figures and legal language. That sentence was a choice. He sent it, then he put his phone down on the table and stood in the room where the fire was burning and Kurt was sleeping and Zion Calloway was concussed and still on a bench, and he did not feel relief. He did not feel closure. He did not feel any of the clean, resolved emotions that come at the end of things in stories. He felt the sharp, specific clarity of a man who has seen exactly what he is capable of doing and understands now, with no room for comfortable distance, that understanding it doesn't undo it. He walked to the bench. He stood over Zion. Zion looked up at him with eyes that were tired and clear and gave nothing away except the fact that they were paying very close attention. Maddox opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The sentences that came to mind were all inadequate in ways that he could feel before he got them fully formed, each one too small, too organized, too dependent on language doing work that language was not built to handle. He looked at Zion's temple. At the discoloration and the closed wound and the evidence of what had happened in the snow 46 minutes ago. I have been wrong before, Maddox said finally. About deals, about partners, about risk assessments, I've been wrong and the company has absorbed it and we have corrected course and moved forward. That is a different kind of wrong than this. He stopped. I don't have a word for this kind. Zion studied him for 3 full seconds. I know, Zion said. That's because this kind doesn't have a word. It just has what comes after it. Neither of them moved. From the door, Zoyer Thorne watched them both and said nothing and held the silence the way he held everything in this space, with complete and unhurried authority, giving it room to become what it needed to become without directing it toward any outcome. Outside, the first edge of Alaskan dawn pressed up at the eastern horizon, gray and cold and arriving without any softness, the way truth sometimes arrives. In an Anchorage International Airport, a gate agent asked Verena Voss to please step to the secondary screening area, and Verena pulled out her phone and looked at the screen, and the Voss Argent Holdings statement was already the top result under her own name, and she stood in the boarding area with her overnight bag and understood, in the way that people understand when they have planned something precisely, and watched it come apart at exactly the point they believed was most secure. That the 3 men she had spent 4 months directing towards someone else had turned around, her hands on the phone stayed completely steady, because Verena Voss was very good at composure, but the federal agent walking toward her from the left corridor was not here for her composure. The Anchorage clinic smelled like antiseptic and old wood and the particular quiet of medical spaces far from cities, the quiet of places that have absorbed a great deal of pain over long years and learned to hold it without comment. Zion sat on the exam table while a doctor he had never met moved a light carefully across his vision, tracking his pupils, asking him to follow a finger, listening to his answers with the concentrated attention of someone whose job required them to find the gaps between what people said and what their bodies were actually doing. Cairo sat in the chair against the wall. He was awake now, fully awake, the fever down to a low residual warmth that the doctor had already assessed and dismissed as finishing, almost gone, burning out on its own schedule. He had his juice box. He was watching everything and saying nothing, which was the version of Cairo that appeared when the boy was processing something large and had not yet decided how to organize it into language. Maddox, Knox, and Darian were in the hallway. Zion could see them through the glass panel in the door, 3 large men in dark coats standing in a medical corridor with the specific quality of men who know that the appropriate thing is to stay outside and are staying outside with discipline, because discipline is the only form of respect they currently have access to and they are committed to using it correctly. The doctor confirmed the concussion. Moderate. Required 48 hours of monitored rest, no screens, no strenuous activity, significant hydration, and a follow-up evaluation before any travel. She wrote everything down and handed it to Zion and told him in the tone that doctors use when they have told someone something and expect it to be followed that she meant every item on the list. He thanked her. She left. The door opened a crack and Knox put his head in. Do you need anything? Zion looked at him, not with warmth. Not with coldness, with the specific quality of a person who is deciding in real time how to exist in the same space as the people responsible for where he currently was, who are simultaneously the people who have just dismantled their own position to correct the damage they caused, and who are standing in a hallway outside a clinic door waiting to know if there is something they can do. Cairo needs breakfast, Zion said. Knox nodded once and pulled the door closed. 12 minutes later, someone knocked and left a tray outside the door without opening it: eggs, toast, orange juice, a container of fruit, everything warm and arranged with the careful attention of someone who has been told to do this correctly and understood that doing it correctly meant not making it into a performance. Cairo looked at it, then he looked at Zion. Did they bring that? The boy asked. Yes, Cairo thought about this for a moment. He turned the juice container in his hands. Are they bad people? Zion was quiet for a count of 3. They did a bad thing, he said. That's different. Cairo considered this with the concentrated seriousness of a 6-year-old who takes moral distinctions seriously. He poked the straw into his juice. Are they sorry? I think, Zion said carefully. They're starting to understand what sorry actually means. He watched Cairo take a long pull from the juice box, and that's different from just saying it. Cairo nodded. He accepted this the way children accept things when the adult they trust has given them a true thing instead of an easy one. Outside in the hallway, the 3 brothers stood in a line against the wall. None of them were on their phones. That was the thing that would have distinguished this moment from any prior moment in the last decade of their adult lives, if anyone had been there to observe it. The phones were in the pockets. No screens, no data, no decisions being processed in parallel. They were just standing in a medical hallway in Anchorage, Alaska, with nothing to do and nothing to direct and nothing to manage, waiting to know whether a man they had put in a clinic was going to be all right. It was the most uncomfortable any of them had felt in years. Maddox spoke first, low enough that it didn't travel past the 3 of them. Statement ran, he said. Verana's attorneys filed a response in under 2 hours. They're claiming coercion. They're claiming the documentation is selectively curated. He paused. It doesn't matter. The federal timeline doesn't change. The drive goes to the investigation regardless of what her attorneys argue publicly. She'll make it ugly, Darian said. She will, Maddox said. She'll try to bring us into it, Knox said. Build a case that we were complicit, even if passively, that the transfers moved through structures we approved and should have caught. He folded his arms. She won't be entirely wrong about the structures. No, Maddox said. She won't. The hallway held the weight of that. The thing about the Voss Empire was that it had been built on certainty, on the kind of confidence that accumulates over generations and eventually becomes structural, load-bearing, so thoroughly integrated into the way a family functions that it can no longer be separated from the family itself. The certainty that their systems were tight, that their people were loyal. That their judgment, across decades and across markets and across every kind of high-stakes situation that money and power can generate, was reliable. Verana had lived inside that certainty longer than any of them. She had helped build it. And because they had been so certain, they had never once looked at her the way you look at someone you might need to verify. They had looked at her the way you look at something foundational, not looking exactly, just assuming, the way people assume the floor is solid before they step onto it. Knox put his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The Alaska Land Trust has to be restructured, independently overseen. Every subsidiary that touched those accounts needs a full external audit. That takes 18 months minimum. Start it today, Maddox said. The Omega Employee Protection Framework that Callaway flagged in his documentation, Knox stopped. He had a section on internal structure vulnerabilities, not just financial, personnel, the way the company handles consultants, the way access is tiered, the way grievances get filed and resolved. He pulled his phone out for the first time in over an hour. He had recommendations. Maddox looked at him. He was building recommendations while he was documenting the fraud. Was doing his job, Knox said simply. That landed, not hard, quietly. The way things land when they are true in a way that requires no additional pressure to settle all the way down. The clinic door opened. Zion stood in the frame. He was upright, steadier than the concussion should have allowed, in the specific way of people who have made their body do things on necessity rather than comfort for long enough that it knows how to cooperate. He looked at all 3 of them. He looked at the tray outside the door, now empty of Cairo's breakfast. He looked at the hallway. At the 3 large men against the wall with their phones in their pockets, and their expressions carrying the specific weight of people who have arrived somewhere they have not been before and are not trying to make it look like anything other than what it is. Ear is sending a vehicle, Zion said. We're going back to his property for the 48 hours the doctor wants. Cairo's better, I'm functional. He stopped. I'm not asking you to come. Maddox held his gaze. We're not asking your permission. That, Zion said evenly, is the exact sentence that started all of this. Hallway went very still. Then Maddox, who had given orders in boardrooms across 4 countries, who had faced prosecutors and hostile media and the kind of financial pressure that breaks organizations, who had not backed down from a single position in his professional life without a strategic reason, lowered his eyes. You would like to come, he said, if you allow it. Zion studied him for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door frame. He did not say yes. He simply moved out of the doorway and left the space open and went back inside to help Kira with his coat. and Maddox, Knox, and Darien followed him through the door, one at a time. No fanfare, no declaration. Just three men choosing a different direction than the one they had been moving in for the last 18 hours, and taking the first step in that direction without knowing how far it went or what it looked like when it arrived somewhere. Which was, Zaire Thorne would have told them if they had asked, exactly how redemption always begins, not with certainty, with the first uncomfortable step. The snow was different in the second week of March, still cold, still covering everything. But there was something in the quality of the light that came through it, a brightness that hadn't been there before, pressing up through the white instead of just sitting flat on top of it. The first announcement that the ground beneath had not forgotten what warmth was and would, in its own time and on its own terms, be moving back toward it. Zion stood at the window of the main room in Zoyer's property and watched it. Cairo was outside. That was new as of 4 days ago, the boy going out by himself, ranging as far as the edge of the tree line and sometimes a bit past it, coming back with cheeks bright from the cold and stories about animal tracks he had found and what he had decided they meant. Zaire had given Cairo a field guide to Alaskan wildlife on the third day, and the boy had spent an entire evening cross-referencing his track descriptions against the illustrations with the concentrated seriousness of someone working on a problem that mattered. He had concluded that what he was tracking was a red fox, possibly with cubs, possibly with a consistent morning route that he intended to document. Zaire had told Cairo he was probably right. That had been the beginning of the boy's full recovery, as far as Zion could measure recovery, not the fever dropping or the appetite returning, but Cairo with a book and a theory and someone who took the theory seriously. The three brothers had been coming every week, not every day. They had not pressed for frequency. They had asked on the last day of the first 48 hours whether they could return. Zion had looked at Maddox for a long time and said, "Come back in a week and I'll tell you if I'm ready to have that conversation." They had left. They had come back in exactly 1 week. He had let them in. The first visit had been 40 minutes. Mostly Cairo doing the talking. The boy had apparently decided that the three large men in dark coats needed to be informed about the fox and had taken this on personally. Knox had listened to the entire briefing, with the same focused attention he brought to financial data, which Cairo had found deeply satisfying. Darien had asked 2 questions, both good ones. Maddox had sat at the far end of the room and drunk his coffee and said very little and looked at Zion across the space with the expression of a man who has been told he needs to earn something and is trying to understand what earning looks like when you have never done it before. The second visit was 2 hours. The third was a full afternoon, no grand speeches, no carefully prepared statements, no moments designed to land with weight, just presence, steady, consistent, showing up when they said they would, leaving when Zion signaled the space was closing. Maddox brought groceries the second time without being asked. Knox brought Cairo a new tracking journal the third time, ruled with grid paper and already labeled with section tabs in Knox's precise handwriting. Darien brought nothing but arrived first every time, which was its own kind of statement. The federal case was moving. Verana's attorneys had filed 3 separate motions in the first 2 weeks, all of them aggressive, all of them constructed around the argument that the documentation had been selectively assembled by a motivated party. Each motion had met the same response from the federal team. The full transfer record, independently verified, spanning 17 months, produced by internal company systems and corroborated by external financial institution records, does not become selectively assembled because the person who found it had a reason to find it. She was out on bond, travel restricted, passport held. The offshore accounts frozen on an international cooperation request that Knox had spent 3 sleepless days building the paperwork basis for. Armand Pelletier had hired 4 attorneys in Geneva and was refusing all requests for interview. The Alaska Land Trust had been placed under independent oversight. The external audit was 6 weeks in and had surfaced 2 additional irregularities unconnected to Verana's main operation, both significantly smaller, both apparently coincidental, both being handled with the same thoroughness that was now being applied to every corner of the Voss financial structure that had previously operated on assumption rather than verification. Zion was consulting on the restructure, not in a formal sense, not under contract. But Maddox had asked on the third visit whether Zion would be willing to look at the personnel access framework document that Knox had built from Zion's original recommendations, the section on internal structure vulnerabilities that Knox had found in the documentation, and tell them what they had missed or misunderstood. Zion had taken the document. He had spent 2 days with it. He had sent back 11 pages of notes. Maddox had read all 11 pages without sending back a single clarifying question. He had implemented 9 of the 11 recommendations within the following week. He had come back on the 4th visit, sat across the table from Zion and said, "The other 2, walk me through your thinking. I want to understand why before I decide." That was the conversation that had lasted 3 hours. At the end of it, Zion had looked at Maddox across the table, at the man who had carried him through the snow, who had knelt in the clearing, who who had sent a statement that cost the Voss family publicly in ways that their legal team was still calculating, and had said, "You're a different person in a room where you don't already know the answer." Maddox had held his gaze. "I'm trying to be that person more often." Trying, Zion had said, is the right word. Praise, not reassurance. Just the specific acknowledgement of a man who understands the difference between the beginning of a thing and the thing itself, and is not going to call them the same out of politeness. Maddox had accepted it, without argument, without deflecting into competence or returning to action. He had just sat with it, which was the thing none of them had been built to do and which, Zion understood now, was going to be the measure of everything that came after. Cairo came back inside through the back door, boots heavy with snow, field guide pressed to his chest. He looked at Zion in the doorway between the rooms and then at the table and then at Zion again. "They coming today?" he asked. "In 2 hours," Zion said. Cairo nodded. He held up the field guide. "I found prints this morning that don't match the fox," he said. "They're bigger, different toe pattern." His expression was serious. "I think it's a second animal using the same route. I want to tell Knox." "Get changed first," Zion said, "and hang your coat." Cairo disappeared into the back room. The sound of boots coming off followed, and the particular thud of a 6-year-old hanging a coat in approximately the right direction, and then the boy's voice from the back room carrying without any effort, "Zion, is it going to be okay? Like actually okay?" Zion stood at the window. Outside, the snow pressed its brightness upward into the gray sky. The tree line was still and dark at the far edge of the property. Somewhere in those trees, a fox moved along a consistent morning route that a 6-year-old had decided to document, and possibly a second animal moving through the same corridor, and the whole complex, careful world of the wilderness doing what it had always done, continuing, rebuilding, finding the warmth underneath before the surface had fully committed to it. "Yeah," Zion said. He meant it, not because everything was resolved. The case was still open. The restructure was still in process. The 4 months of fear and the night and the snow and the blood against the white and the sound the stone had made, none of that had been cleaned up by apologies or actions or groceries delivered to a door. That was not how it worked. Healing was not a dramatic thing. It was not a transaction. It was exactly this, a morning where Cairo asked a real question and the answer was true, and the light coming through the snow was different from last week in a way that mattered. 2 hours later, 3 sets of boots came up the path. Cairo heard them from the back room before any adult in the building registered the sound, and he came out with his field guide already open to the page with the second set of prints, and he went directly to Knox. No preamble, no setup, just the field guide in Knox's face and the theory already in motion. Knox took the guide, looked at it carefully, said, "The spacing on the outer toes is wider. You're right that it's not the same animal." He turned the page to the larger carnivore section. "Let's cross-reference." Cairo sat down next to him at the table with the full-body commitment of a child who has found the person in the room who will take the work seriously. Darian sat across from them and looked at the guide over Cairo's shoulder without being asked, which was the Darian version of joining something. Maddox came to the window where Zion was standing. He stood beside him, not close and not far, and looked out at the snow. They stood there without speaking for a while, long enough that the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms between people who have been through something together and are both inside the same understanding of what it was and don't need to put language on it right now. Then Maddox said quietly, "Zaire told me something this morning." Zion looked at him. He said the wolves watched this property for 6 weeks before the night in the clearing. Maddox's eyes stayed on the tree line. "They were watching before we came, before the tabloid, before any of it. They were already here." He paused. "He said they knew." Zion was quiet. "Knew what?" he said. Maddox turned to look at him. And in the flatness of the Alaskan midday light, in the window of a property built into a hillside 60 miles from the nearest city, something moved across his face that was not the controlled gravity of a man managing his expression. It was the face of a person who has seen something they did not expect to find and is still organizing what it means. "That you were worth watching for," he said. At the table, Cairo had found the page he was looking for and was pointing at a print illustration with the specific urgency of a child whose theory is about to be confirmed. Knox was leaning in to see it. Darian was already nodding slowly. Outside, the snow moved in the light. The tree line held its quiet. In the distance, somewhere along the route Cairo had mapped, 2 animals were moving through the cold Alaskan morning on their own paths, old ones, established before anyone arrived, continuing long after everyone in this building had gone back to wherever they were going, while above the highest ridge, the sky pressed down its flat gray weight on everything below it and showed, just at the eastern edge where the horizon bent away, the first undeniable reach of something warmer coming slowly. Coming on its own terms, but coming. If this story reached something in you today, that moment where truth comes out, where power meets its limit, where a child's hands on a chest say more than any apology ever could, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn your notifications on. Every story we tell here is built to hit different, built to make you feel something real. This is not background noise. This is the kind of story you come back to, the kind you share with the person who needs to hear it today, and the kind that keeps you thinking long after the last word lands. Drop a comment below and tell us which moment in this story stopped you completely. Was it the clearing, the drive, Cairo asking if it was going to be okay, or the wolves who were watching long before anyone else knew what was worth watching for? Share this with someone who needs to know that the truth, even when it comes late, always arrives. And do not miss what's coming.